Hey everybody, so I got this painting from Kate, who had watched one of my YouTube videos and then made this painting, and she did a fantastic job. But we're going to be focusing on how to bring this painting to a finish, make it feel a little bit less fake and a lot more real, and give it that finished look. She's done a fantastic job in following the tutorial. She's really captured the sense of light. She's got a great sense of form. The colors are nice and rich. But she had reached out to me saying that I think my art lacks life and light. Even though I like the realistic style, it still looks not pale, but sort of dull. And I have no idea how to improve that. Particularly with this picture, I tried adding more colorful yellow and pink and almost white as well, which only looked wrong. So it didn't end up in the final image. So this is awesome, super excited to share my thoughts. And what I want to do is actually invite you into how I strategize a painting, how I create a plan, because at this stage we already have so much of the form already established. We need to really be careful about how we juggle our relationships, which is going to be a big theme of this video. Now, this apple feels like it's the same green all the way through, which is great to start as an overall impression, but having more color variation will make it feel less fake and more real. So I've added some colors that are relatively gray or perhaps more blue for each of the main values. Essentially, I'm taking a color and then on my color picker, I'm dragging it over into something less saturated. And then I can simply put it down right next to that color. Same thing for this one. Just drag it over to something less saturated, but I'm keeping the same value. And Kate, I feel like your painting has a lot of color in it already. So maybe adding those yellows and pinks and things isn't going to help. It might actually be that bringing in less saturated colors will help the colorful parts stand out more. Art is all about relationships. So if you have a relatively gray area next to a very saturated area, then that saturated area is going to appear even more colorful and full of life. And then I'll also add in a more red variation as well in case we need them later. So I'll take this and I'll just drag this hue slightly towards orange. And I might not even use these, but I just want to have them on my palette. I'm gonna just move this over closer towards red, which is really just gonna kind of stop. I mean, let's keep going. Let's go over here because I'm gonna be putting this down on top of the greens. So I'm okay with that. And then this one, again, we'll just kind of push this over and put that down. So we have these slight variations from the values. And I don't think we need to do that for this. Maybe we could do a yellow version, maybe something a little bit more warm. Again, just to have it available to give us some flexibility. And I'm also checking my values, which is easier to see in grayscale. And these values are getting really close to their maximum brightness. And so that tells me that I could probably bring in some darker values, which would then help some of the highlights actually stand out even more. But once again, we're seeing how making one thing look darker can make another thing look brighter. Relationships, it's beautiful stuff. And I think we also have room to go brighter in some of these areas with some highlights. But the final piece to the puzzle is edges. Overall, I feel like this painting is very soft and smooth, which gives it this unnatural feeling. So we want to put our shades down in a way that creates sharper edges and also more modulation. Edges don't have to be just soft or sharp. They can be broken, they can be scattered. There's all kinds of ways to use edges to create an effect. So I'm going to bring in some modulation in here where the light and shadow meet. And I made a video on that specific area just recently, so you can watch that. I will also be strengthening my edges where there are cast shadows on these areas of focus, like in here. And then my highlights as well will also get some sharper edges. So now we have our strategy and I'll just start painting. So I'll be using the round brush here, which is going to allow me to manage the pressure that I'm applying, but also keep some sharp edges intact. And I've selected this relatively blue or gray color, and I'll push that into my shadows here. And I'm going to let it spill in because I know that I can afford to go darker in my lights on the other apple as well. So by bringing in this little subtle color change, amplify the colors of the rest of the apple as well. I can focus on details now, so I'm going to just bring in some of these little kind of stripy parts of the apple. Let there be a little modulation, a little mixing, a little overlapping of values on top of each other. And this works for traditional too. And I'm using a value that's not drastic. I'm not taking this very, very dark value over here and pushing it in and potentially ruining my relationships. This is just a subtle shift in color and only a slight darkening of the value as I'm putting it down into the light. And you can already see how this red is beginning to emerge, but I'm going to take that and push it even more. I feel like I can get away with amplifying it, so I'm just gently bringing this red on top. So I'm using my pressure to keep this controlled and not go overboard. I haven't touched this area, but look at how it's starting to feel warm now. Let me capitalize on that. I'm going to take this slightly yellow color and push it in. And then in here, I'm finding this feels a little bit dark to me. And as I'm looking at the jump in value between these two, I do feel like I need to mix a new color specifically for that in-between value. It just would help really create a better connection. So I'll stick with something colorful that would fit nicely in between. So I'll just put that down, and I'm just looking visually. I feel like it's too close to this value. So I'm going to go darker, a little bit more even. And I think that's kind of a nice in-between for these. So I'm going to let this get a little bit darker. I'm also going to use this new shade to brighten this up a little bit, since this is acting as a value that kind of goes in between my light and shadow. So it still reads as a shadow, but it's just a little bit brighter because there's a lot of light bouncing around in there. And I'm also going to use this value for more of that modulation and some of the details that I want to capture, just getting that texture of the apple. And you can see that I'm really not zooming in. I'm just trying to get this overall impression. Maybe I'd be zooming in a little bit more if I was really trying to refine this really nicely, but just for the sake of impression, this is what I'm focusing on for now. And I want to move this highlight more to here so I can strengthen this sharp edge. So I will take this and knock this back a little bit more. So we still have the impression of a gradient, but it's just a lot more modulation going on in here. Having my palette sort of figured out for me and specific designations for the colors for their values really helps. Like this, I'm treating as a shadow value. I don't want to put this into my lights without really careful thought. I do feel like I can go darker here, so I'm going to take this slightly less saturated value and let this start to creep its way through, which will probably have a stronger impact on the gradient that I've been working on with all of its modulations. It still doesn't look more realistic yet, but we're getting there. Now I'm going to start going up in value, and I can use this to start creating more texture, more of those details, kind of go over some areas to take out some of the unnecessary sharpness that I've brought in, subtle variations to show the organic nature. And I still want to maintain my overall gradient. As long as I'm using the right values in the right area, I don't have to be afraid of destroying my impression. Now I'm going to strengthen this edge in here, this cast shadow. So I'm just going to push this right up against the edge there. Now, if I strengthen the edge, I might find that the contrast is too high. So I'm going to change the shape of this just a little bit, but I'm also going to try to stick with a value that's not too bright. Maybe something more like that. And now I'm going to push into it to remove any lines or anything. I'm going to zoom in here. I'm just going to push into this and make a really strong edge for that cast shadow. And I also want the edge of the stem to be sharp as well. I think I want to take this value and push it up into here and clean up some of the edges a little bit. I'm getting a little bit dark, so I'm just removing that, but I'm keeping this nice silhouette of the stem intact. Then I can work on my values in between, and to do that I'll go back to my in-between value until this gets properly knocked down. I don't have any problems with recreating a gradient. I know how to make one. So I am being watchful. This is nice in here compared to this, I feel like. I think adding this additional color has really helped to clarify what should be most colorful in the painting. This is going to be our most colorful section because it's where the light and shadow meet. As we go further up, I'm actually going to start deviating into these colors here so that this relatively can stay more colorful. These are really colorful, and I feel like they're actually, this is fine, but this one is so colorful, it really should be moving into something less colorful so that the color really happens down in here. Again, relationships. We're seeing this at every stage of the painting, juggling these relationships. So I've kind of strengthen this. I now am really liking what's going on in here. So I'm going to bring that into my transitions. And I hope you can also see that I'm really unafraid to make a mess and reestablish something again. All the hard work of creating the form has been captured beautifully by Kate for me. And so now I just get to play around. Okay, so we're coming back over here. So we've got this stem. I sharpened this edge, and now we've got a soft edge in here, which is fine for the form shadow that exists. But we don't have that established yet. And I'm going to use a warm variation. Why not? I've got this color here. Something that's not going to drag too much attention, but I will put this in, and I'm okay with letting these values overlap each other because that's actually going to help contribute to a form shadow. And it doesn't need to be exactly the same as what we have, but we definitely need to go brighter. I think we'll have to resort to this for our shadow. It reads as a shadow because it's surrounded by all of these other bright values. And we can come back to this value, strengthen it, let it overlap a little bit. Now that I've lightened this whole value already, I can take this darker value and just put it right in here, which will help me strengthen the edge I want against this later on. So it's kind of working. I think maybe I extended it too high up, so we'll just knock that back. So something more like that, just going for its overall impression. But now it feels like it's kind of coming out of that little space there. So that suffices for our overall impression. I've strengthened it, I've sharpened it up, and this is okay with being sharp because these edges are kind of a little bit sharp too. So this might not feel terrible because this, like, there's a relationship of edges too. Before, this may have felt too sharp if it was razor sharp because this is so soft. But now that I've sharpened my gradients a little bit, given them some more modulation, this is now working as an effective impression for the painting. And I think there's more work to do in here. I do want to just maybe push this in a little bit more. I don't want it to extend out too far, and as I'm doing that, maybe too much. I am assessing my work always. I do want it to read as being soft. Not trying to make the proportions be perfect with each other. That's not the focus of this. Now I'm ready to go into my highlights. So rather than go to here, I'm going to go into these two here. So I'll start here. Just going to see what this gives me as I put this down. It might be too dark of a value, and it's okay. I want to put this in the areas where I see less color, because again, that's going to let other areas in the painting that I want to have more color stand out. So I'm putting it along the edge in here, just wherever I want there to be less color. I really want to make sure that I have a lot of color in here. I don't need as much in there. So this is very subtle work. I'm even going to bring it into here to prepare right along here. I'm going to sharpen this edge, and I'm preparing for what will be some bolder highlights coming in. I'm going to let this come in and then cut this up a little bit. See how that little modulation there, this is kind of a subtle cast shadow that I'm taking advantage of, using my knowledge of how to turn form with my edges to more powerfully accentuate something. Okay, so we've brought in a little bit of gray, but it's subtle, and it's letting these areas in the color stand out more. Now I can bring in this value, and I'm going to be really selective. I don't want to go overboard, and I think this is dangerously the wrong value. Like, look at how bright this is. This against this, given what the painting is already doing, this feels like I might need to just push the value up a little bit more. I go up in value. Now, when I put this down, it should read as a cooler tone, and I can let it be kind of sharp. It's surrounded by the correct values that it can be put down pretty boldly and sharply, and it still works. But you can see I am kind of erasing. I'm trying multiple iterations to see what works, and it feels a little bit weird by itself. So when I bring in these other highlights, that should strengthen it a lot more. So I want to lay these down boldly since they are my highlights, not applying complete pressure, letting it fade out a little bit in certain areas. But you can see it's kind of creating more texture. Can bring it into here a little bit on the left side. As I'm feeling it out, I can get more bold, and I'll probably need to knock these down just a little bit, let them spill into some other areas. We're just using a very, very gentle pressure. I am allowing the value to spill over into other values so that I have this modulated look and feeling. But that's overall, it's just increased the sharpness of my edges, which helps bring this into focus. It helps us imagine what the details would look like on this apple. That suffices as far as communicating this idea. I'm just going to move over to this other apple, bring in this very bold highlight, and then more gentle pressure. I will let this invade these areas, and I'm not even changing the value that much. I'm really just taking out a lot of that extra saturation, which is then pulling the saturation to the area between the light and shadow, which I think is having a stronger effect. There's kind of a lot of work in here, maybe too much work. Maybe if I went back, kind of looked at this from a distance and felt like, I've got some of these modulations in here, but how are they affecting the overall impression? So I want to come back to that. After all the work I've done, I always want to check that overall impression. Maybe I need to come back and grab this darker value and just pinch those highlights back into their proper place. Very tempting to overwork with your highlights. So coming back to look at this from a distance can be really, really helpful for that. And maybe just working with a larger brush will force my hand, forcing simplicity. And then rather than go for this really bright yellow for a highlight on the stem, I'm going to use a much less saturated one, and that feels a lot more natural to me. You can see how often I check the reference to get direction. I'm not trying to copy it per se. I'm just looking for answers. And I will say, like, I think this area has been a little bit more overworked than I'd like. This in here looks nice to me. There's a simplicity to it, a real nice sense of structure to it. Kate brought in a really nice texture in here, and I've kind of buried a lot of her gentle texture work. But this I had left untouched, and I think this is also helping. Sometimes a variation, this is another relationships, right? A variation in style in the same area can have a big impact as well. Like if I started to maybe work with just a different brush, but you know, something like that is kind of adding some additional character, suggesting certain things in a way that kind of breaks up some of the homogeneousness of using the same brush or same application of paint. Definitely more tools to explore here. Just going to take some of these and push them into these highlights. The highlights are also, you know, they're just capturing form. It doesn't need to be much, but just a little bit. And I could use this blending tool and soften down some of these edges, and they will still keep some of that modulation intact. So, you know, depending on what you want to go for, like if you want to put your highlights more sharp edge in here and then these are really soft, you can try different things, try different relationships that you want to create, you know, for whatever works with your style. But I'm enjoying this. The impression is working. So I feel like I've played around long enough with the apple. I'm going to move into my highlights. If you recall, I knew that I could bring in brighter values into here, so I am going to take this and let's play around. Why not? Let's do, this looks kind of cool. Maybe we can do something fun with this. Just bring in some of these brighter values. I'm not going to get too realistic with this, so actually we'll just let these things kind of spill over, which is just going to sort of be a quick cheat way of giving me some interesting texture and a sense of realism. It might be too damaging. Like, you do want to make sure that you have a cohesion between different styles. So like if this doesn't belong with that, maybe that would be something you have to address. Doing all this, I think, has created a problem. So this is a lot tighter and this is a lot looser, and this is an area of focus. If this was more in the foreground and not an area in the focus, then maybe this impression could work. But because of how tight this is, and with this being an area of focus, this would need to be tighter in order for us to really take advantage of the texture that we've created here, which I'm not going to bother to do all that work. But maybe I could take some of this and knock this down. Now that I feel like I've gotten more of a finished look going on, I'm now going to think a little bit more about my depth and the visual journey I want to create. I want people to look here first, and I want this to fall back. And I feel like this dark value is really dark, and it's creating contrast from here to here, and also even from here to here, when I might want people to look at this apple and then that apple. So this contrast is really strong right now. Maybe I can just reduce this. So you can see the color that's over here is actually a little bit more blue. So let's see what happens if I do that, see what I can get away with. So here, there's a couple artifacts that I think have appeared, but that I think kind of helps. I think now that the blue that I had originally added actually kind of connects it a little bit better. It's not as much of a sting, and then maybe I can even take some of this. Why not? Let's see what happens. I'll take this with my round brush. I think I'll kind of come in with a large brush here, and I'm just going to gently start to make this darker and more of that background color, basically. See what it does to the overall impression for the sake of the painting. So now we have kind of more of a separation, but maybe, I think if anything, it made this look more realistic because the values are like even closer together, which is interesting. So I think maybe the real work is going to be in edges. So I'm going to really kind of push this around. I'm just going to soften these edges way back in here, loosen them up because we want them to feel believable, but we don't necessarily need them to be tight and detailed and defined. So I'm just kind of throwing these edges around, smushing them around to blur out the edges. And notice how the apple, or both of the apples, are really coming into a lot more focus now. And this might be just a bit extreme. Maybe I'm doing too much for this. But you can see how a new relationship is created, from the apples, which are now the tightest thing, into this very kind of eye-catching texture, and then these very kind of soft and loose edges in here. You don't have to like it. It's totally fine if you don't. I can even kind of grab some of this edge, sort of pushed into there because I get a little bit more movement. But you can see how I'm using relationships to really kind of tell a story in the painting. We look here, now we look here. So I think that's a little bit more effective than, say, what we had going on before, which was to look here, and then maybe down in here. It's kind of more jarring for the experience. So there would be ways to make this more elegant and more subtle, find something a little bit in between, not so clunky and chunky. I'm actually going to backtrack and revisit this section. I want to see if I can help maintain the impression of realism that Kate was going for. I don't want to kind of bulldoze my own style into this while trying to help Kate out. So I've just brought in these slightly sharper highlights, and now I'm going to knock them down just a little bit to take some of the sting out of them. Just the edges, letting them be a little bit softer, letting them keep some interesting variations in their shape to help capture that satin texture and reflective nature of the cloth. All right, so now I'm going to more carefully knock back the background. I'm still using a fairly large brush, but I'm just going to be more thoughtful about how much I soften it and trying not to push my shapes around too much. There are other ways to blur out an entire area, so we are going to lose a lot of the beautiful form that Kate had captured, but hopefully it's going to be worth it because it's going to draw more attention to the areas that we really want. Working on this back edge first, and I'm comparing the edge of it in relation to the apples in front, softening these edges without making it feel like a loose painting, and make sure that the form still makes sense. I am even letting some of that green of the apple spill into here. Kind of adds a very nice glow. This will just make sure that it's razor sharp while that glow is still intact. You choose something that's not pressure sensitive, like this syrup brush, and I can cover all this entirely, whatever area I want to get knocked back. And then I can take the eraser, which I'll use as a soft eraser. I'm gonna let this brush get a little bit bigger so I can get it a little bit softer out into here. The original layer underneath and a duplicated layer on top. So if I take the opacity and bring this down, I can now selectively choose how much I want this to fall back. And I don't think it needs to fall back very much at all, but you can see this little bit compared to maybe just the smallest amount, like right in here, helps to bring that back. And you can see how now all of the information in here is really jumping forward really nicely. This is feeling a little bit more connected to the background. So we'll see the difference. Just that small amount. Very gently taken out. Okay, so now to make this a little bit more realistic, I just want to get in nice and close, keep my blending tool nice and small. So I want to keep those variations. I just want to take some of the edges down. So we'll just work inside with a very small brush. It's always good to kind of zoom back out, make sure that you're not going overboard, trying to keep a lot of the information and modulation intact. So something a little bit more realistic. Just giving you some ideas and food for thought on how you help a painting look and feel more finished. So I hope this was helpful and informative and that you learned a lot in the process. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions in the comments, and in the meantime, I'll keep plugging away here. Thank you guys. Have a beautiful day.